inside leg position, brings it down, a great chance for Gilzean, and it must be a goal.
Alan Gilzean. Ice in the veins, fire in the mind, silk in the finish, silence in the celebration. He didn't roar, he didn't dive, he didn't point to the name on his back. He scored and walked away. No chaos, no theatre, just presence, just timing, just class. They called him the Ghost because he was always there before you saw him and gone before you understood. He gave the game his vision, his patience, his quiet brilliance, and the game, it moved on. Statues were built for the loud, legends were crowned by volume, and Gilzean faded into silence. But silence doesn't mean forgotten, and quiet doesn't mean small. Not when you made football feel like poetry. Alan Gilzean, the ghost who passed through defenders and through history without ever needing to be heard. Subscribe if you still believe football should honor those who never asked to be remembered. Alan Gilzean wasn't born into noise, he was born into stillness. October 22nd, 1938, Cooper Angus, Scotland. No fame, no headlines, just football. His first contract came in 1957, signed by Dundee as a 19-year-old with no reputation, no swagger, just a touch sharper than the rest. And then, he exploded. 169 goals in 190 league appearances. No spell, no purple patch. This was what he did every week. He wasn't fast, he wasn't fierce, but he moved like a thought and finished like a man who didn't doubt himself for a second. In 1962, Gilzean carried Dundee to their first and still only Scottish League title. Not Celtic, not Rangers, Dundee. And at the heart of it all, the silent assassin. A year later, he took them to the European Cup semi-final scoring, assisting, dismantling giants like Cologne, Sporting Lisbon, Anderlecht. They fell to AC Milan in the Final Four. But by then, Europe knew the name. And still he said nothing. No interviews, no flair, just the ball, the net, and the walk back to the halfway line. He didn't play for the stage, he played for the geometry. Angles, movement, rhythm. He made the game look inevitable. By 1964, he had nothing left to prove in Scotland. He had conquered it all without ever raising his voice. But 440 miles south, Tottenham Hotspur were watching. And they didn't need words. They needed intelligence. They needed silence. They needed Gilzean. He arrived without fireworks. January 1964. A quiet signing from Scotland, £72,500 from Dundee. No press frenzy, no big unveiling. Just a lanky forward with a sharp touch and a silent mind. Spurs fans didn't know what to expect. He didn't sprint. He didn't shout. He didn't have the swagger London loved. He was 25, already a Scottish icon, but in England he was still a question. Was he too slow? Too gentle? Too quiet for a league built on grit? Gilzean didn't answer them. He just started playing. And almost immediately, the doubts faded. He wasn't just a striker. He was a reader of the game. A man who saw runs before they were made, who knew when to pause, when to release, when to disappear and reappear in front of goal. Within weeks, Spurs fans realized, this man played chess on a pitch full of drafts. He didn't wrestle centre-backs, he ghosted past them. He didn't need power, he had angles. And in a team full of loud brilliance, Greaves, Mackay, Blanchflower's shadow still lingering, Gilzean offered a new kind of silence. He'd score, assist, hold, glide, and walk back to halfway without a glance at the crowd. By the end of that first half season, they weren't asking, who is this guy anymore? They were asking, how did we ever play without him? If Greaves was the fire, Gilzean was the shape of the wind. One danced, one drifted, one scored with flair. The other made it look like fate. Together they were unstoppable. Jimmy Greaves, the most lethal striker in English football, needed no partner. He'd scored for fun since he was a teenager. But when Alan Gilzean arrived, something changed. Gilzean didn't chase space, he created it. He didn't compete for the limelight, he redirected it. Where others ran at full speed, Gilzean paused, waited a second longer, then played a ball that made Greaves unstoppable. It wasn't flashy. It was surgical. They played in perfect rhythm. Greaves scored 44 goals in the 1964-65 season, and again in 1965-66, he hit 25, many of them laid on by Gilzean's invisible strings. Pundits called it instinct, but it wasn't. It was intelligence, pattern recognition, spatial genius. Gilzean understood the geometry of Greaves, and Greaves trusted the silence of Gilzean, and the crowd they came to expect it. The one-touch flick, the delayed pass, the run Greaves didn't even know he'd make until Gilzean's foot told him to go. They weren't just a pairing, they were a phenomenon. And when Greaves moved on, Martin Chivers arrived stronger, brasher, more direct. But Gilzean adapted. He dropped deeper, passed quicker, played wiser. He turned Chivers' fire into focus, a second act of brilliance from the Ghost. And though it would never be hyped like duos today, every Spurs fan from that era will tell you. We had the two smartest forwards in the league, and nobody could stop them. Gilzean and Greaves didn't rehearse. They just understood. It wasn't loud, it wasn't choreographed, it was football, at its highest possible IQ. The 60s faded into the 70s, and Gilzean, the silent operator, kept collecting trophies without ever lifting his voice. 1967 FA Cup. Spurs beat Chelsea 2-1. Greaves didn't score, but Gilzean? He made the game hum. His aerial control, his delayed passes, his space creation, all of it bent the final towards Spurs. 1971 League Cup Spurs over Aston Villa, 2-0, with Gilzean pulling the strings. Another Gilzean assist. Another walk back to the center circle without a celebration. Gilzean, by now deep into his 30s, still dictating play, still making defenders chase ghosts. And the crown jewel, 1972 UEFA Cup. 1973, another League Cup, this time against Norwich, and still, he walked back without fanfare. A two-legged final against Wolves. Tension, tactics, grit. But Gilzean stood tall, scoring in the first leg at Molineux. Spurs won 3-2 on aggregate. It was their first ever European trophy. A historic moment. And yet no headline was written for Gilzean. He didn't hold the cup aloft, he didn't lap the pitch, he simply shook hands and walked into the tunnel. But ask any Spurs fan who watched it live who really ran that final, and they'll say, Gilzean, quietest man on the pitch, smartest man on the planet. He wasn't chasing fame, he was curating football. Each trophy a quiet masterpiece signed in shadows. By 1974, the whispers grew louder. For Scotland, he wore the dark blue 22 times, scoring 12 goals alongside legends like Dennis Law and Jim Baxter. No World Cups, no spotlight, just timeless class in quiet boots. Gilzean was now 35. The legs weren't gone, but time was no longer his teammate. Spurs were evolving. New blood was coming through. And for a man who never chased the spotlight, there was no interest in fighting for it now. His final season saw fewer starts, fewer touches, but still moments of grace. He made it to 343 appearances for Tottenham, scoring 133 goals, and assisting countless others in ways that never made the stat sheet but made the difference. No televised testimonial, no farewell tour, just a final match and a quiet exit. No goodbye speech, no boots held aloft, because Gilzean never wanted the noise, only the game. And when the time came to leave White Hart Lane, he did what he'd always done, he walked away without asking to be remembered. But the fans? They remembered anyway. For those who saw him play, he never left. In 1974, after a decade of elegance at Spurs, he chased one last whisper of the game not for glory, but for love. He journeyed to South Africa, signed with Highlands Park, just for 3 months. No trophies, no headlines, just football pure and simple. The legs were slower, the hair grayer, but the brain still 2 passes ahead. He taught with glances, with timing, with silence. He passed down the art how to breathe in chaos, how to move before the moment. Then, as always, he walked away. Quietly, without fanfare, just like he lived the game. After he retired, Alan Gilzean did not chase the camera. He didn't become a pundit, didn't write columns, didn't tour the nostalgia circuit. He simply disappeared from the noise. No Twitter, no farewell interviews, just a quiet life in Enfield, London. Occasionally, a Spurs fan would spot him near the lane. Polite, still elegant in posture. Happy to talk football, but never about himself. Years passed, football changed, the game grew louder. But the fans who remembered never stopped. They wrote of him in forums, posted clips with reverence, called him the classiest ghost to ever wear white. Then, in July 2018, the silence became permanent. Alan Gilzean died of a brain tumor, aged 79. He passed away like he played without fuss, without complaint. But when the news broke, a ripple passed through British football. Spurs legends paid tribute. In 2009, Dundee FC formally inducted him into their Hall of Fame, a silent striker, finally honoured by the club he once lifted to the sky. Tottenham Hotspur held a moment of silence, and fans at White Hart Lane sang his name. Scotland remembered the boy from Cupar Angus who made football look effortless, and suddenly his name returned not to headlines, but to hearts. He never wanted to be famous, one fan wrote. He just wanted to play beautifully, and he did. He never asked for a statue, but his memory stands taller than many who did, because some legends are not forged in sound, but in style, stillness, and soul. He never raised his arms. He never kissed the badge. He never begged for a legacy, but he left one. Because in a game built on noise, Alan Gilzean made silence sacred. He moved like poetry, scored like instinct, and passed like a prophet with no sermon. He wasn't the loudest, the flashiest, or the headline, but he was always the moment before the cheer. A touch, a glance, a flick no one else saw coming. That was Gilzean. And though time passed and the world moved on to louder heroes, his name still floats through the minds of those who understand football, not just as a sport, but as an art. Alan Gilzean. The man who faded from the front page, but stayed printed on football's soul. Subscribe if you still believe the quiet ones write the most beautiful chapters.